So far, we've talked about kind of the benefits of urban systems, right? And their complexity, um, their dynamism they have in terms of creating economic output, their centers of innovation, hyper-connected. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the challenges faced by cities. So far, you've read about urban sustainability from an environmental lens, looking at, auto dependency, density, increased resource depletion, etc. Um, we started talking a little bit about urban renewal, right, and what that means, and making like the 15-minute city, for example. Um, you have to understand anything we do is going to have an equal and opposite reaction, right? So even our best intended policies or infrastructure, whatever it may be, are going to have ripple effects, and some of those are not as positive as others, and we're going to always have some drawback, and the benefits do not necessarily are not equally distributed across the city, right? So let's talk about some challenges that cities face. We're going to be kind of oscillating between MDCs and LDCs because they face different problems, right? At least now. What we do see, though, is that cities like London and Paris 200 years ago, they were faced with the same complex issues that we see in the rapidly urbanizing areas of today, like Mumbai or Caracas or Rio de Janeiro or Lagos, right? So we see the same problems again and again, just in different place and time. So first, I want to talk not about increased crime rates. I want to go down one, talk about affordable housing. So we know that in San Diego, right? In California specifically, the idea of affordable housing. What is affordable? Property is very expensive, right? I'm concerned about my own children and how they're going to afford a down payment in 20 years, 30 years, I don't know, and what that looks like for them. Because I know my own challenges my wife and I had in purchasing a home. It's out of reach for a lot of people, right? So we see this not just in California, but California is a great example of this, but all over the United States, major cities, the properties are incredibly expensive and increasing in price. That's due to demand and supply and people wanting to live where they want to live, right? So in dense urban centers, not so much in suburbs, but that's changing too. What do we see cities doing? How are they responding to alleviate this lack of affordable housing? Well, one is rent control. You may have heard of that. It was in California. It was on a ballot actually in California for the whole state, like how we're going to cap rents. So it caps the amount of rent a landlord can charge per tenant for in specific places or based on income or even age, like elderly, things like that. And that there's just some drawbacks to that because it de-incentivizes investing in real estate, which then hurts the whole market, right? But it also allows usually the most vulnerable groups to have a place to live and some stability, which they need. And the city needs that on all sectors. Public housing. So public housing, what that means is the government's involved in some way, right? There's a few ways in which the United States and different cities have tried to provide affordable housing through public funds. One way is to subsidize housing, to pay part of the rent if you qualify. So a family makes $2,000 a month, whatever that is, and they'd have to spend all of that on rent, but some of that's subsidized, so they just pay, I don't know, $400 or $800, whatever it may be. Another thing cities have done, and it turns into a really negative thing, they've created projects or Section 8 housing or these concentrated hubs of poverty where they're government subsidized, built, and run facilities. And what we tend to see is those areas are neglected in terms of services, repair, infrastructure, etc. And they decay over time because they don't appreciate and value. There's not a lot of investment happening in them in terms of just their maintenance. So that we're going to hop up to increased crime rates. we see these areas of high concentrations of poverty. We see people are desperate. They lack a lot of opportunity, right? So, and they're isolated from other. They're isolated from social mobility. They're isolated from education systems and really the formal economic sector. So formal meaning you're getting a paycheck that's regular. It's above board, right? It's legal. So people, in order to survive, are pushed towards the informal sector. Now, this can be like, anything from, selling lemonade or helados, right? Those aren't permanent necessarily, right? They're not part of the formal sector. But we also see another end of that spectrum is drug trafficking, prostitution, not really laundering money, but illegal activities that are detrimental to people's being, right? And then what we see is more people in these areas are drawn to that because they lack other opportunity. And there's no real political force or political infrastructure there to help them. So what happens is that vacuum, that political vacuum, is filled by drug dealers and gangs, etc. Right? And we see this in the United States in pockets here and there in different cities. But really, one of the places we see this most, or maybe the most famous, I guess, is in Latin America, the favelas of like Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, Venezuela, Caracas. Favelas are hotbeds of crime. And that's their political structure, is based on this informal economy, because no one there actually owns the land they're living on, but they create, in a sense, a informal economic hierarchy, unfortunately, that deals with violence and things that actually hurt generations who live there. So some other things that governments can do, really in MDCs, but it could work in LDCs as well. Inclusionary zoning laws. So an example of this would be, let's say you're a developer and you want to build a 300 unit condo complex. You would legally have to set aside like 18 to 10% of that for low income housing, low income families, that their part of their rent would be subsidized, right? It's one way to do it. So you don't have such a concentration of poverty. It's spread out. And it might not seem obvious, but investment in public transit, because to have access to jobs, to education, to services, healthcare, whatever it may be, you have to get there, right? So if you don't own a car, that car's cost is prohibitive. You can't access that ladder, right? So an investment in real efficient and effective public transit is going to allow for people to get to work. You're going to increase mobility at all sections of the economic scale. And increasing mobility increases economic activity, which raises everything. More taxes are collected. Those taxes then should be put towards services to help elevate the population, etc. Some other things we see. Environmental injustice. So we're going to talk about two things here, right? Infrastructure that's built. This could be fire protection. You don't think that is being built, but it is. Water, for example, in Flint, Michigan. Those areas, when they were created, when they were urbanized initially, 80 years ago, the economic draw was manufacturing. Well, our new global economic system, those manufacturing or secondary jobs have moved to LDCs, low cost labor. So there's less taxes collected because the economic base is gone. People leave, and people who are stuck there are the most vulnerable, right? But there's less taxes being collected, so there's less being done in terms of maintaining infrastructure, for example, water pipes or water treatment plants. And Flint still doesn't have clean water, and it probably won't happen. We also see this in like LA, for example. If you ever notice, like driving through Long Beach in LA, there are neighborhoods that have like oil derricks next to them. Rich people don't live near those. middle income families don't live near those because they can afford to live elsewhere. So we're constantly seeing the poor are regulated to these unhealthy environments. And we also see they tend to have, in poor neighborhoods, tend not to have grocery stores because those major grocery chains do not invest in those communities for a myriad of reasons. So we tend to see those regions suffer from higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of asthma, higher rates of hypertension partially due to the lack of access to healthy food, because they're purchasing their food from liquor stores or quickie marts, convenience stores, tend not to be as nutritious. So that's environmental injustice. And then we have land tenure. So what does that mean? It means you own the land. So when we're talking about favelas in Brazil, if we go up again, the favelas or slums of Nairobi or wherever we're talking about, those are not owned by the people who live there, right? That is a drawback. It doesn't allow for someone to draw value out of their home and invest it in something else. Like your parents, or if you own a home, you can take out a line of credit against your house and then use that money for other purposes, whether it be education, cars, whatever it may be. Right. So that's not accessible to these individuals. And they also tend to be on the least desirable land. So they're dangerous, right? There's definitely gender discrimination in terms of land ownership. It is illegal in some regions based on cultural norms that have now manifested themselves politically for women to own land. We see this with agricultural workers in Africa, right? A lot of the women there who work the land themselves cannot own it. And a myriad of issues come along with that, right? It cuts off social and economic mobility. Eminent domain. Pardon me. That's recorded. Eminent domain is when the government, local or state or federal, decides that this piece of land that you're living on, or whatever it may be, needs to be something else. And they can invoke eminent domain and purchase that land from you for not necessarily market value. So, and what are they building there? Freeways, schools, possibly hospitals, military installations, whatever is needed, deemed necessary. And that's deemed necessary, right? The eminent domain tends to affect poorer neighborhoods more than wealthy ones, because wealthier neighborhoods have more political power, and their money is louder, right, than poorer neighborhoods. So unfortunately, they are the ones that suffer from land being seized in a sense, and they're forced to go somewhere else. The uproot communities. That's a lot. I know that. So the next two slides, we're dealing with challenges still specific to declining tax base, infrastructure costs, and how that relates to poverty. All these things are related, right? And they're really not linear. They're actually cyclical. If you have infrastructure costs that are too high, the city cannot support them, maintain them. They start to erode. This is police, education, fire. This is electricity. This is water. These are sanitation workers, trash collectors, right? Those things are breaking down. You're going to decrease the value of the land. Landlords can't charge as much. They're less likely to invest in the building itself. It dilapidates, it decays. People leave, or people who come in have less income, right? So again, we just see this declining tax base. Less taxes collected, less investment in infrastructure. It just cycles back. So this poverty creates poverty. Wealth also consequently creates wealth. And who is impacted by this? Marginalized groups, the elderly, new immigrants, minority groups in urban areas tend to be regulated in a sense to these regions if they lack access to opportunity. So this is looking at that cycle as a cycle, right? It just winds itself down. It all deals with investment. There's less investment because there's less money collected to invest, and it just spirals down until the whole region is redone, right? Which is a whole host of other problems as well. So how did, in the United States specifically, but really we see things like this happen all over the world. There are housing policies that are discriminatory. Technically, they're outlawed, but some version of them still occur. One of them is block busting. Block busting is predatory real estate tactics in which a real estate agent, for example, would go to a white neighborhood and say, hey, watch out. These minorities, these marginalized groups are moving in. And you don't want your property to fall. So they're preying on racial stereotypes and bias, even if it's slight. So the family sells for below market value. That real estate agent then turns around and sells it to a minority group, minority family, for above market value because there's services or perceived services there. It's a leg up. Well, this happens a few times, and then what we see is it flips. The neighborhood flips. It's outlawed technically, but it still happens to some extent in terms of like loans. There is a huge problem in terms of home loans, small business loans, primarily going to white middle income families and business people versus people of color. We can see it here in San Diego, in southeastern San Diego. There's this like drastically less loans approved in that region. If you have access to that link, it takes you through the logic of life, and it goes through a thought experiment of segregation and how it happens. And it's just the idea that individuals might be rational, but as a group, we are not. And it explains how flipping a neighborhood happens over time. Another form of housing discrimination that is outlawed now, but happens in a different way, is redlining. And this deals with home loans. Banks, institutions, financial institutions, not loaning giving home loans to people of color to live in specific areas because it's deemed as less desirable. And they literally, the entire major cities all over the United States was redlined. So if you're in the green or the blue, you're more likely to get a home loan versus the red, literally redlining. And guess what? Those regions that were redlined were primarily minority neighborhoods. And so what we see is this cuts off whole groups of people from generational income, because one of the best ways to pass on income or wealth to your children is the owning of a home. Well, if that home never appreciates in value, you're limiting the amount of value you're passing on to your children. So it cycles generationally. So so we have urban renewal. Okay. Urban renewal is another side of gentrification in a certain way. Urban renewal sounds positive, right? But depending on what your perspective of that action is, it might be gentrification, which is negative, right? In the 1960s and 50s, there was a federal, like millions of dollars, put into clearing out deindustrialized areas. Our economies were changing. We're moving from manufacturing to tertiary slowly, but still happening. So we have a lot of urban decay. So urban renewal is intended to combat that. Well, what it ends up doing is it displaces poor residents. And people, it doesn't necessarily mean people of color, but primarily what we see generally is there are people of color as well. And these neighborhoods are cut in half. Highways are put through them. That eminent domain idea is used to move these individuals. It does nothing in terms of increasing access to social mobility. It just moves people around to other pockets. So maybe the intention is good, but its ripple effects might not be. So gentrification is when a neighborhood gentrifies. It becomes redeveloped. When there's new investment coming in from outside the community into the community, but it's not for the people who live there. We see this happening in Mid-City, University Heights, North Park, South Park in San Diego, Golden Hill. We see young, middle income or upper income households moving into those areas. And in doing that, raising the property value, which raises the rent, which pushes people out, right? So the good thing is the property value increases. New businesses are attracted there, and there's a new renewed investment in infrastructure. The problem is that, again, it's not solving or helping alleviate poverty. It's just moving poverty somewhere else. What we've seen in San Diego is the movement east, primarily the south side of the 8. It increases social tension and homelessness. Right? It's something if 40% of your income is on housing, you are like 13 times more likely to become homeless in your lifetime. Anyway, folks, there's a lot of breakout rooms with this. Hopefully you can check that out in the Zoom we're in. But yeah, it's not an easy fix. All this is incredibly complex, and you move one thing, you have to move 4 more. It's a giant puzzle, but it's people's lives. All right, folks, you have a great day. Go ahead and email me if you have questions, or come to the tutorial. It's a good deal. Tutorial later.